In this part of the lecture on SART, we're going to talk about anti-racism, facticity and action. Some of those themes of freedom and identity and how free we are really. So existentialism from the beginning is linked with anti-racism. Sartre himself wrote a short essay called Anti-Samaritan Jew in 1944, so just towards the end of World War II, which is an existentialist analysis of racism. Beauvoir, in The Second Sex from 1949, which we will look at next week, identifies the same underpinning structure to racism, sexism, and other prejudices. So importantly, Beauvoir although she calls it her work The Second Sex, she realised that a lot of what she was saying about women applied to other groups who are on the end of prejudice. She also wrote a book called America Day by Day, 1948, in which she reacts to what she saw when she went to America at that time, segregation and anti-Black racism in post-war America, especially in the South. So she wrote in her diary, it was a kind of diary she kept as she was travelling through. She said, "This is the first time we're seeing with our own eyes the segregation we've heard so much about. And although we'd been warned, something fell onto our shoulders that would not lift all through the South. It was our own skin that became heavy and stifling, its colour making us burn." Also, Frantz Fanon is a Black existentialist philosopher. Those are his dates. He was of West Indian background, and he knew Sartre and was involved in that sort of group at that time. So he was also known as Ibrahim Frantz Fanon, and Frantz Fanon was his war name. He was a political philosopher as well as an existentialist. He was a psychiatrist, considered himself a political revolutionary. And his key works are Black Skin, White Mask from 1952. It's a kind of psychoanalysis of the oppression of Black people. And here he argues for the limits of traditional ontology, that is, philosophy of the structure of existence, of being, for understanding Black existence, in that it ignores lived experience, he says, because Blackness was created in and continues to exist in negation to whiteness, end quote. So he's one of the early philosophers to recognise this way that a Black person gets racialised in relation to white people. Also, his famous work, The Wretched of the Earth from 1961, was all about decolonisation, where he was defending the right of colonised peoples to defend themselves, to use force against their oppressors. And interestingly, Sartre wrote the preface for that work. So this basically brings about the development of a distinctive Black existentialism movement, so what is now known as Black existentialism. So some characters from this history include W.E.B. Du Bois, who wrote The Souls of Black Folk, and he gave us the concept of double consciousness, that is, living a contradiction, for instance, being Black and American in a country that didn't recognise you as fully human. We've talked about Frantz Fanon. There's Cornel West, some of you might have heard of, the US political philosopher. There's Black feminist existentialists such as Anna Julia Cooper, Catherine Gines, and Lewis R. Gordon is probably one of the most prominent Black existentialists at the moment. He wrote a book called Fear of Black Consciousness in 2022. We'll talk a little bit more about him. In terms of literature, important works include Ralph Ellison, his book The Invisible Man. Richard Wright wrote The Outsider. He was very close to the French existentialist movement. Basically what happens is quite a few Black Americans go over to France around the mid-century period because they're freer in France than they are in America. And France was desegregated, people could, Black people and white people could have a drink together, in a bar and that kind of thing. And of course, James Baldwin, he wrote, for instance, The Fire Next Time, really interesting work. And some of you might have seen the film I Am Not Your Negro, which came out a few years ago. This is James Baldwin here. And the author Toni Morrison, very famous for her work, The Bluest Eye. So giving basically accounts of the lived experience of Black people and people of colour, and particularly of what it feels like to live in a society that denies your humanity. So particularly Lewis R. Gordon is a contemporary philosopher who's quite prominent in this area. So from his book, Fear of Black Consciousness, he says this about the existential lived experience of Black people. Erasing the humanity of racialised peoples involves the production of invisibility of their consciousness and means. Although there are many kinds of invisibility in the Euromodern world, 5 are particularly pertinent. And so he basically unpacks these 5 types of rendering a human being invisible, rendering their consciousness as a human being invisible. Remembering that for the existentialists, your consciousness is what makes you human. It's what's at the heart of your humanity. So racial invisibility, denying the facts of your ethnicity and your existence, Indigenous invisibility, the forgetting of Indigenous people, gendered invisibility, erasing your gender, pretending it doesn't exist, exoticized invisibility, where you only see someone through the framework of exoticization and you don't see them as an equal human being, and epistemic invisibility, whereby you don't recognise the theory of knowledge and the history of knowledge that person's culture has. So this points to the idea that existentialism could be seen as global, and certainly since the focus on the European existentialists, many people have recognised that there are existentialist traditions all around the world. So essentially, existentialism is an approach to doing philosophy rather than a philosophy in itself, perhaps. At least that's one way that people think about it. So you might like to see Lewis's article, Existential Philosophy and Anti-Racism, an interview with him, and that's on reading list. Okay, so let's continue looking at being and nothingness, just reminding ourselves of the structure or overview with these 4 parts, and we've been looking at the problem of nothingness. So further themes we're going to investigate from this work are the ideas of facticity versus transcendence and the issue of how to resolve these. So given that you've got these things that we can't change, but the existentialists are also asserting that we have transcendence via our consciousness. How do those relate to each other? The different modes of being, or our consciousness, particularly as they are revealed through our emotions, motives and reasons for human action, and Sartre has this idea of the fundamental project, which we will explore, and a critique of Sartre's theory of freedom, for instance, Althusser's. So there are many people, of course, who will challenge Sartre's account of freedom. And his stories about the emotions, what he says about the emotions, actually get developed quite early in his career. So it's in 1939 he writes a piece, Sketch for a Theory of the Emotions. So Sartre says that emotions are magical ways of dealing with the world. They're things we choose, and they're ways of responding to the world. They're as a way of changing our relationship to the world or changing the world itself. Okay? So emotions are an expression of freedom. So Sartre gives examples. Desire, for example, some we give up and some we choose, or we choose to go along with. Coping with disaster, for example, sadness, feeling sadness might be a way to avoid having to cope with it. You just sort of sink into this feeling of sadness. So it's a way of reacting or changing our relationship to the world. And danger, feeling danger might involve removing yourself out of that danger by fainting or going into hysterics. So emotions are ways of dealing with the world that aren't strictly rational. It's questionable whether Sartre thinks anything we do is really rational. He thinks that there's a lot of sheer choice going on, or contingency. So Sartre thinks emotions are basically, our ways, our particularly human ways of dealing with the world. So he contrasts emotions with more rational ways of dealing with the world. Rational ways of dealing with the world deal with the world as it is. So, To look at an example of sadness, when you say, I am sad, you're also saying, I am sad, therefore the world is depressing. And this is an emotional way of dealing with the world. Right? You view the world through this lens of feeling sad. But a more rational way would be something like, I see the world as depressing, therefore I am sad. So you manage the emotion and you see the emotion against the background of the world. A response to this might be, well, it can be hard to overcome the bodily dimensions of emotion. For example, becoming paralyzed with fear. That doesn't feel like a choice or something you can rationalize, or the bodily or the chemical element of depression. The idea that you can just sort of turn on a more rational way of dealing with the world. It doesn't feel like there's an option there. Again, it's not always clear if Sartre is, critiquing these ways of dealing with the world, or he's just saying, look, sometimes we do this and sometimes we do that. Reflecting upon your freedom may not immediately enable you to overcome your emotions. So if you just realise you've got some freedom to sort of see things differently, that might not actually result in a change. So let's think more about the relationship between freedom and the facts or facticity we confront, where facticity are the brute facts about the world and transcendence is our consciousness of the world. So Sartre has this problem of trying to relate freedom to facticity. He asserts, firstly, to be human is to be in the world, following Heidegger. We're acting in the world, and essentially says you are what you do, right? So when you do things, that's your identity. Your identity isn't some claim you make about yourself, but it sits in what you actually do in the world. However, when it comes to the sphere of our action and what we choose to do, surely you would argue, look, the world is not of my own choosing. It is spatio-temporal, it's material, there are natural properties that are governed by laws, it's socio-cultural, and we are embodied. For example, we are subject to gravity, aging, illness, we have bodily needs. So all of this you would think belongs to facticity, and these are not things that we choose. So they're all, rather than being part of action themselves, they are part of the conditions for action or the background against which we act. So Sartre admits that we do have to take these into account. They can limit our possible action. We cannot do whatever we want to. And this just brings back that point that when Sartre's talking about freedom, he's not talking about freedom of action necessarily. He's talking about the freedom of our consciousness, which may or may not support free action in the world. So in order to act, we have to understand these constraints, although not necessarily accept them. For example, taking a taxi costs money. You might accept that taking a taxi or an Uber costs money. You may or may not let that constrain you from choosing to do that. You might accept that lying in the sun too long causes sunburn or cancer, but again, you may not necessarily let that stop you. So we all sort of do things when we sort of know that they may have bad consequences. That is, we must understand our own actions and intend them against this background of constraints. So Sartre further explores freedom and action in part 4 of Being and Nothingness. And he divides human action into different elements. Firstly, there's intention, for example, jumping off a cliff, not being pushed off. So we have to intend or choose to do something. The aim or end is what the intentions are directed towards. Thirdly, the motive, which is the desire for the end. For example, a thirst for justice or a need to cool yourself down by jumping into the sea. And 4, the reason, which is how the action will achieve the end. So it's kind of the rationale. How exactly is jumping into the water going to cool me down? So why does it make sense for me to do this in order to achieve that end? So when we're acting against the background of a state of affairs. So this is a technical phrase that Sartre uses, state of affairs, which means it's how you see your surroundings. That is, you see your surrounding context as lacking something. Okay, and you need to do this or that particular thing. So you've interpreted the facts around you. So to drill down a bit further, a motive is an ensemble of desires and is relatively subjective, where the reason is a means for achieving desires, or more objective. Okay. So the ensemble of desires doesn't have to conform with any sense of reason or rationality we have, whereas the reason is meant to make sense against some ideal of rationality. So motives are fundamental, and Sartre says, look, we don't deliberate about motives. They just sort of come. Right? We have these desires, but we do about reasons. So then there's this question, well, where do the motives come from? Because if they're coming from sort of outside ourselves or something, then how are we free? Well, the existentialist answer, which you might think is a bit tricksy, is your motives are you. Whatever those desires are, they are just you. This is getting very close to Freud's theory that we're all fundamentally a boiling pot of emotions underneath. So motives and ends together will determine what counts as a reason. An objective state of affairs doesn't give me a reason. I actually have to construe it a certain way according to my desires. So I might see a state of affairs as lacking something, or I've interpreted it some way, but really until I really bring in my desires, it's not going to motivate me or give me a reason for doing what I do. So I have to construct it a certain way for it to make sense as giving me a reason to do what I do. So let's look at one example. He gives a bushwalking example. He tells the story about a fatigued bushwalker. And he says, well, depending on how you're going, you're getting tired, you're walking along, your motives might change depending on how you're going. So Sartre says, fatigue by itself could not provoke my decision. Okay, the mere fact that I'm tired will not cause me to choose this or that. There's more to it. I've got to interpret the fatigue in some particular way. I've got to respond to it in some particular way. So, just a little bit more on that example. If I am feeling tired, I could say, well, this tiredness is a good reason to just stop and take a rest. This is meant to be an enjoyable walk. And it's not enjoyable when I'm tired. So if your fundamental motive here is that you just want to enjoy yourself, then fatigue will be a reason to stop walking. But if you're doing it for exercise, you might push through the fatigue. The fatigue doesn't work as a reason or anything to motivate you to keep walking. Another example is the crag example. So I ask you to imagine a crag, right? And you're looking at this big rock. How you feel about that rock will depend on what your project is, so what you bring to the rock, as it were. So what this crag means to me depends on what my project is. As Sartre says, a particular crag, which manifests a profound resistance if I wish to displace it, will be, on the contrary, a valuable aid if I want to climb upon it in order to look over the countryside. In itself, it is neutral. So this is very important as an example of the difference between what Sartre considers to be facticity, the brute facts we come across, which is just kind of neutral in itself, and then how we react or interpret these things. So in this case, he's saying, look, if I want to push it out of the way, displace it, it's going to be a profound resistance. I can't. I'm just a small person and that's a big rock. However, if my project is I want to go high so I can look down over the countryside, actually it's very valuable to me. So how I view it as negative or positive will very much depend on what project I'm bringing to it. So being difficult or easy to climb depends on our having wanted to climb it in the first place. So we can't characterize it objectively as difficult or easy. That's going to depend on whether we actually wanted to climb it. The judgment difficult or easy depends on what instruments we have, how our level of skill, how much help we have from our friends and so on. So it's all very dependent on the context. Now, Sartre admits that we can come up against adversity. He says, the rock will be easy for one athletic climber, difficult for another, a novice who is not well trained and who has a weak body. But the body in turn is revealed as well or poorly trained only in relation to a free choice. It is because I am there and because I have made of myself what I am that the rock develops in relation to my body, a coefficient of adversity. So this is a phrase Sartre uses to describe the level of difficulty or easiness things in the world present to us, and that they are not essentially part of the thing, but they're related to our free choices of what kind of projects we have going on and what we make of ourselves in relation to whatever it is we're encountering. So there is no objective coefficient of adversity. It is all a result of the actions of our consciousness coming from our choices and our interpretation of the situations we're seeing. So there's always resistance and adversity to our projects, but it's only because of our projects that we judge something as adverse or difficult in the first place. So one way to think about this is what Sartre calls being in situation, which is basically how I understand and interpret my surroundings in a more subjective way. So we saw the term state of affairs. State of affairs is what's given to us or a sort of immediate appraisal of the situation. But to see the state of affairs as an actual situation in this technical sense is more selective and value-laden. It requires a usually unreflective but a free decision to see the state of affairs in a particular way relative to my projects. So what's important for Sartre is that the world does not determine this. I do. No one else is telling me how to interpret this. I'm doing it myself. For example, I understand my surroundings as lacking something. I understand, for instance, the house needs to be painted. I understand that I'm too tired to complete my project. These understandings are relative to the context of myself and my projects. So I see my surroundings as lacking something depending on what I think I need. To take this case of the house with the paint peeling off, I understand that that house needs to be painted only if I don't like the way it looks. If I like the way it looks and I think it's fine, then I don't understand that the house needs to be painted. And I understand that I'm too tired to complete my project only if I think it's more important, I judge that it's more important to accommodate my tiredness than to complete my project. So that's, a choice I'm making, essentially. Sartre makes reference to something he calls the fundamental project, because we're asking about motives, right? We're wanting to know, well, these basic desires, these motives, where do they come from? He says when we ask about motives, we can't really look for a cause. There's no real cause, they're just contingent. He says don't look for explanation, but look for understanding. So, for example, we can ask, why did Sartre want to write a book? We might answer, well, because he wanted to be famous. And then we can ask, why did he want to be famous, and so on. And so the idea is that when you keep asking why and why and why and why, you get to broader and broader motives eventually. A narrower motive can become a reason for a broader motive. So when you're asking, well, why did he want to write a book, more specific, you get a broader motive like, well, he wanted to be famous. Why did he want to be famous? Some ideal of what he thinks the best human life is, something like that. So you're going to get broader and broader motives, broader and broader desires as explaining why you did what you did. Now, there's this issue of autobiography or biography telling the story of my life or somebody else's life. Can I really know who I am? Can I know my fundamental project, my fundamental desires or motives? Well, Sartre says no, because projects are future orientated. Remembering Heidegger says we are futural beings, and I can't know the future. Sartre says I am not now my future. A life, Sartre thinks, can only be understood in retrospect, that is, after someone's death. Because we're open, we're free beings, we can choose all sorts of things, we can't pin ourselves down in this way. until our life is actually complete. However, we can get closer to our ultimate motive, Sartre thinks. So there's something called existential psychoanalysis, which Sartre and other existentialists of the time thought can uncover layers of motivation. So you can ask questions about why are you doing what you're doing, why have you chosen what you've chosen, and go deeper and deeper into layers of motivation. But one thing you might ask, well, is if you have this fundamental project, this fundamental motive or desire that's sort of powering your whole life, how is it possible that you can change through time? How is change compatible with the fundamental project? Well, one possible answer is that there's an appearance of change, but no real change. For example, swapping one addiction for another. If someone has a fundamental kind of addictive personality or addictive sort of desires, you might, end one addiction, but just replace it with another. So you might stop smoking, but then you might start vaping instead or something. Also, sometimes we might recognise that people have radical changes in their life, radical conversions, for example, from atheism to theism to some sort of religion, or vice versa. They lose their religion, they have a radical change, radical political conversion. And so you could see this as a big change in someone's life. However, from Sartre's point of view, you could interpret this as being just a different kind of fundamentalist about a set of beliefs. So, for instance, if you were, and there are cases of this, someone who's a radical religionist of some sort, and then suddenly drops their religion and becomes sort of radically atheist, or vice versa. You're still a radical, right? You're just a different kind of radical. Many different political groups and religious groups like to kind of hand out literature, little pamphlets and leaflets and things. So you might change from one to the other, but you're still the kind of person who's handing out, leaflets and literature. So basically, these changes might not be as big as they seem. So I guess Sartre's explanation versus understanding distinction is what he thinks is important for thinking about the fundamental project. There possibly is a deepest original motive, and you can use it to understand a person's motivational structure or pattern over time. That is, existentialists recognise that people don't just seem to be making totally random choices over time. Their choices often sort of fit into a bit of a pattern. It's their way of being in the world, but existentialists hold they have still chosen it. Okay. So you could say I am my motivational pattern, but this is not fixed or given. So I'm creating myself as I live my life. I'm making choices, and that may well form a pattern. But there's no sense in which this is fixed. This is just that I keep choosing similar things. So on this sense, human life is objectively utterly contingent. In fact, Sartre says man is a pure upsurge of contingency. It's not that it's meaningless. It's got the meaning that we want to give it. So this means we can have no ultimate explanation of our life choices, but we can have an understanding of them. So as Cutruffello says, though my fundamental project is something that I myself have freely chosen, I am not necessarily aware of it, because living something at the level of one's pre-reflective consciousness does not guarantee reflective awareness of it. So this distinction between pre-reflective and reflective consciousness, we're always conscious, but we're not always that reflective, right? So in everyday mode, we are pre-reflective and may not be aware of our freedom or what we have chosen. We can sort of go along on autopilot. It takes reflectiveness to really grasp our freedom and our choices, to really understand what we're doing when we're making the choices we make. So Sartre is urging us to carry out this reflection. And what will the result be? The result will be, he thinks, that we realise that we are free and responsible. We are all free and responsible all the time, but we may only realise it or understand that when we engage in reflective consciousness. When we reflect, that is via philosophy, for instance, rather than just sort of go through life in a fairly pre-reflective way. There is this issue of constraints on our action, and Sartre does acknowledge that there are these constraints. We've seen he talks about the coefficient of adversity of things and the sheer resistance of the world. And that's why it's important to recognise this distinction between freedom of action versus freedom of consciousness. The most fundamental constraint we have is that, in his famous words, we are forced to be free. Nothing can constrain our freedom, the freedom of consciousness. So Sartre accepts all this, but he argues we're still always free to reevaluate a situation, interpret it differently, and so on. Now, a possible response to this is, well, then how free are we really? So Marxist and various political commentators and critics, such as Marcuse, will critique Sartre by saying, look, you don't realise how much people can be constrained. And indeed, it's very much part of Marxism is the theory of false consciousness, that it may appear we have a free consciousness, but actually it's been constrained to an extent that it's false, that it tells us things that are false and we can't trust it. So to challenge Sartre's metaphysics here, you kind of need to prove there's a lack of options for interpretation, because Sartre isn't actually claiming that you're free to do anything in the world, or the world doesn't have any physical restraints on you. Rather, that you've at least got the freedom to interpret situations via your free consciousness. So you can think of an example, say embodiment, for example, being short. There might be cultural constraints that may constrain the way you think. For instance, you might, depending on the culture, you might see yourself as inferior because you're short or shorter than average. And this would be, on some accounts, an internalization of societal attitudes. It doesn't feel like you have a lot of options for interpretation there. So if we were to visualize this, you think about facticity, the set of facts we confront in our world, and then there's available a range of interpretations. But how many interpretations are available to us may depend on how constrained we are culturally or by our social situation, right? So to argue with Sartre, you would have to say that certain situations constrain the interpretations available to us. So the big question here is the range of interpretations available limited by such constraints? So one example is women's embodiment. You might consider, in the context of a patriarchal culture, there may be a limited range of meanings available. For example, the idea that to be female is to be more passive, less active. You might be not taking up opportunities for action with your body, or not having a confidence in your body to do things. An internalization of for others as for itself. That is, you may start to be too obsessed with how others view you as opposed to how you view yourself. Now, these are the kinds of examples that Simone de Beauvoir takes up in The Second Sex, and that's what we're going to look at next week. So a general point you might say, or point to in arguing with Sartre, is that one function of societal conditions is to maintain social order, so to prevent change. So one thing you might do is present the status quo as natural. This is not just the way it happens to be. This is natural. This is the way it essentially is. So you can think about the case of women, presenting, women's subordinated condition as natural and how it was always meant to be, or impoverished people. The idea that the poor will always be with us. You just have to accept that. You can't really eradicate poverty. It's just natural. Fundamentalist religions often play on the idea of a certain strict hierarchical structure as natural and unchangeable. So if you're stuck within one of those systems, how free can you be? Well, a possible Sartrean reply would be, look, you can always imagine otherwise. And he would point to historical evidence of things like revolutions and rebellions which lead to action. you can't have a revolution unless you can imagine some kind of alternative future. So even the most oppressed people, in fact, often it is the most oppressed people in history who so boldly are able to imagine an alternative future. He also might say to regard a representation as natural, you must have understood and internalized it, which proves the freedom of your consciousness. That is, you haven't just passively viewed something, you've actually internalized a judgment. And so this implies that you may have a power to accept or reject representations. For example, women in sexist society can theoretically accept or reject representations, and people of colour in racist society. So if you've understood and internalized a representation, it's possible you could also not internalize it. It's not something that you're just born with. So on this view, if you're a victim, you have to take a certain amount of responsibility for internalizing your oppressor's view, essentially. You're not responsible for what happened to you, but if you've internalized the way your oppressor sees you, you have to take some responsibility for doing that and understand that that is changeable. Other possible responses might be to shift from mental representation to bodily practices. So stop worrying so much about consciousness and pay attention to what's happening at the level of the body. So people like Althusser, who was a contemporary of Sartre, and Foucault, who we'll be discussing later in this course, might say, look, you don't have to explicitly teach people things. They actually kind of absorb it in their bodily practices, so they can start to think of themselves as inferior without actually explicitly teaching this claim. It's rather you encourage them to perform certain practices that subordinate them. So this is basically a theory of the social construction of the subject in response to Sartre's emphasis on personal freedom, which many people think is excessive, and structuralism generally. So a possible Sartrean reply might be, look, I accept social construction, but I insist I am more than that. Yes, I'm socially constructed, but I'm not 100% socially constructed. There's always some fundamental level of freedom. I still have to choose what to do about it, and nothing determines my choice of response. So whatever sticky situation I'm in, I still have a choice about how to react or what to do about it. So later Sartre will write a book called Critique of Dialectical Reason, which has more of a Marxist influence. It was an attempt to try to bring existentialism and Marxism together. All right, next week we'll look at the work of Simone de Beauvoir. She tries to address some of these issues of freedom versus responsibility, possibly giving a bit of a more nuanced account. She focuses on the theme of embodiment, particularly women's, and she tries to work out exactly how much responsibility or freedom someone can have in a situation of oppression.